Hi, welcome back. Over the course of the next 4 videos, we're going to look at some more general tips when EQing drums. Now, I really want to stress that these are really going to be general guidelines because there are so many variables involved that EQing is always an entirely subjective thing. It will always be specific to each situation. To give you an example, every drum kit sounds different. How it's tuned will make it sound different. The types of mics used to record it, how they're positioned, the room the kit is in, all of these things will make a difference to how you EQ the drum kit. And on top of that, you might find that some drum sounds have a lot of energy in a particular frequency range, and other instruments in the mix have a lot of energy in that range as well. So again, you could get your drum kit sounding perfect on its own, but then as soon as you add it to the mix with other instruments, it might not sound right because they share key frequencies. So we're just going to focus on some general broad frequency ranges that tend to apply to specific drums. And in this video, we're going to start with the kick drum. With the kick drum, we need to pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the sub-bass region. And part of the reason for that is because a lot of the sub-bass region we can't even hear. Just to quickly illustrate on this operator synth here, if I play a really low note, and we'll look at the frequency, that's around the region of 33 Hertz. Now, we can see that the level is quite high, but we can't really hear it that well. Whereas if we play a higher note, we can see the level is exactly the same, but it sounds a lot louder. And that's because it's within the range that our ears are more sensitive to. So when it comes to a kick drum, if we now trigger a clip and just solo that, you can actually see in that region we just looked at, there's actually quite a lot of energy. And we really don't need that to be there because, as we just saw, we can barely hear it anyway. It's taking up room in the mix. And you might hear that referred to as headroom. It's taking away the headroom, which means you haven't then got as much level above that to play with. Plus, on top of that, if you're using other effects plugins such as compressors, then that signal that you can't really hear but is still there will still have an effect on those plugins. And it can take away the clarity, make it sound muddy, and so on. So what we can do about that is maybe try sticking a high-pass filter with a fairly low curve and a low frequency somewhere down around 30 or 40 Hertz, somewhere in that region. Now, we've already seen before that this region up here around between 50 and 60 is probably the sub-bass that we might actually want. So this high pass we can have a bit below that. And we don't need to roll off too much necessarily. That might be enough to just take away some of that rumble that we really don't need. But you can make it a more extreme slope if you want to. Now, this might depend on your EQ. You might have the ability to choose the slope in decibels. You might choose 6, 12, 24, even up to 48 dB cutoff, which would make it a very sharp slope. But you might only need a small amount. Now, the thing to be aware of, though, is at some point we'll start losing some of the actual frequencies that we want. So you want to keep it fairly low and just roll a bit off there. You could also try using a Knotch filter and just set that right down to that frequency there. And you can see that gives us a nice sharp curve, which might leave the other frequencies that we do want intact. So apart from that, we have actually looked at the sub-bass and bass frequencies relationship in the previous videos. In particular, we looked at mixing the kick and the bass. So I'm not going to go too much into that here, but I'll just briefly point out again that the sub-bass region is really between that 40 Hertz up to about 80 Hertz. And then the bass region is between about 80 Hertz and maybe 120 Hertz. So you need to get that relationship between those two right and decide what is going to be prominent in each. And that goes for the kick, the bass guitar, and the toms. The toms is another sound that has a lot of energy in these regions, but we'll look at them later. So moving beyond that, another region that you might want to pay a little bit of attention to is between this 250 to 300 Hertz. Now, I'm just boosting really to demonstrate the sound itself. I would never necessarily recommend boosting in this region by this amount by any stretch. But you can kind of make out there's a little bit of a ring. Now sometimes just a little bit of a boost around here, maybe a slightly wider or lower Q setting, can bring out some of that nice ring in the kick drum. That might be a little bit of a warmth, but this is a region that really you need to be very careful with, because almost everything has a bit going on in this region, and certainly a lot of key instruments tend to have a lot of energy going on in that region, particularly between 120 and 300 Hertz. We've got vocals, guitar, even the snare. A lot of sounds tend to have a bit going on there. So this is a region we're going to see again and again. So I would not necessarily recommend boosting in that region. But if you did want some of that ring to come out, then you might want to try cutting some other instruments in that region. And then moving past that, if we go up to the 2.5 kilohertz, up to maybe even 6 kilohertz, you can hear that's where the click or the attack of the kick comes from. That's really the sound of the beater hitting the skin. So if you find the kick gets a bit lost, then you might want to try a boost in this region somewhere, just finding where that brings out that click. Or if you find there's too much of it, you might want to cut it. So that's sort of the region you'll find that kind of clickiness in. And same goes again, if you want to bring it out in this region, you don't necessarily have to boost it here. You can maybe try cutting something else in that region. Okay, that's all we're going to look at for the kick. Thanks for watching.